Just waiting for the 95 video cameras to be ready. Not that candid, I'm aware. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this series called Responding to God's Call, Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Spiritual Life. I especially want to thank you for coming this evening when two world historical events are taking place. That is the Romney-Obama debate and the simultaneous benching of A-Rod and Nick Swisher. So I thank you all for coming. I said before that I would interrupt every time Yankees got a base hit, which would only be probably once in the next hour and a half. Sorry, a little inside baseball humor. I want to just begin taking a moment to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Dennis Goldstein, father of Ray Janvey. Ray Janvey, many of you know, has been a very cherished mentor to many of the founders and leaders of Machon Hadar and Hamakom L'Chem Tachre. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was one of the most influential religious figures of the 20th century. A prolific scholar who wrote on everything. An eloquent and impassioned theologian, a prominent social and political activist. He did a lot in 65 years. He has been hailed as a hero, honored as a visionary, and endlessly quoted as a devotional writer. Endlessly quoted. I sometimes imagine that the one thing all American Jewish rabbis have in common is that it's Friday afternoon, you don't have a Dvar Torah, you pull a book off a shelf, you find an aphorism that you really like, and you build from there. But what was Heschel actually saying? Not just in short aphorisms or wonderful kind of pithy inspirational moments, but what was his theology, what was his worldview? I worry sometimes that people do one of two things with his writings. Either, as I just indicated, they treat him like a kind of ever-flowing fountain of great quotes, or they dismiss him as, quote, a poet rather than a theologian. In fact, some people do both of those things at the same time. That is, call his writings for great inspirational moments, and at the same time say, but right, as a philosopher or theologian, he's not that serious. At some point in these lectures, I hope to talk about why, I don't know when it'll happen, we'll see when it kind of seems like the right moment, why for Heschel, the very formulation of poet rather than theologian betrays a profound lack of understanding both of poetry and of theology. I want to try to kind of battle against something that takes place both in the academy and to some degree among rabbis. People all too often become either worshippers of Heschel's or actively hostile critics of his thought. And what I hope to do in these 5 lectures is to carve out a more productive middle ground where we take Heschel seriously on his own terms as one of the major Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, but we also engage him critically and sort of probe at where the problems of his thought are. I want to basically spend the next 5 weeks thinking about how Heschel understood the world, and sometimes explicitly, and sometimes only implicitly, asking whether and how he can still teach us as human beings and Jews in the 21st century. And I hope that will both be part of the lectures and the give and take afterwards. My shameless plug, which I'm not very good at doing, is if you find these lectures interesting and provocative, the more philosophically developed versions of them will be available from Indiana University Press in September of 2013. So, you know, write letters to Amazon and move it up the list from 4 million to 3,600,000 at the bestseller list. I do think, I want to sort of say this up front, that Heschel offered a lucid and fairly consistent interpretation of the Jewish tradition. But it is also nevertheless apparent, if you have spent more than a few minutes reading Heschel, that linear presentation of ideas was not his strong suit. It's one of the things he did to contribute to those who say there's no system of any kind there. I think that's wrong, but it's also understandable, and as it were, he kind of asked for it. And so one of the things an interpreter of Heschel has to do, if he or she wants to interpret him well, is follow the principle that appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Divrei Torah aniyim b'makom echad v'ashirim b'makom acher. The words of Torah are poor in one place and are rich someplace else. That is, in other words, if you want to understand, let's say, Heschel's theology of wonder, you cannot just read those chapters in God in Search of Man that are called wonder. You also have to look for throwaway comments in all kinds of essays where you find really important insights to what he's doing elsewhere. It's a kind of tremendous process of excavation to figure out whether or not there is some kind of system underlying a thinker who can't really present ideas systematically. Tonight, I'm going to mainly focus on exegesis, that is, on getting some of Heschel's ideas right on the question of wonder. I hope during the question and answer, before the mass exodus 15 minutes before it ends, because people want to see whether Obama is alive, I will say more during the question and answer, I hope, about the strengths and limits of these ideas, at least from my own perspective. So let me begin with a kind of prelude. If you look at the first source on the packet that you have, there's a sentence there that I just want to spend a moment talking about. Heschel says the following: among the many things that religious tradition holds in store for us is a legacy of wonder. And on the face of it, that sentence is extremely odd. Right? One of the dangers is Heschel writes beautifully, and you read quickly. But if I were to ask you to finish the sentence, among the many things that religious tradition holds in store for us is a legacy of blank, I guarantee you that no one in this room would have said wonder. People don't usually think of legacies of wonder, and they don't think of tradition as that which generates wonder, which people tend to associate more with spontaneity. You might have imagined a traditional Jewish theologian saying the following: among the many things that religious tradition holds in store for us is a legacy of fidelity, commitment, observance, piety, faith. But wonder? Can a sense of wonder be passed from generation to generation? Can you really talk about inheriting a legacy of wonder? I want to suggest that this sentence, perhaps a counterintuitive sentence, can serve as an interpretive key to one of Heschel's primary goals as a religious writer. He wants to undermine and subvert the idea that there is an inherent tension between spontaneous religious expression on the one hand and received tradition on the other. And I want to underline in that sentence, he's arguing against the notion that there is an inherent tension, which is not the same as arguing that there is no tension in the real world. Let me explain what I mean by that. Martin Buber, in one of his early essays, borrowing a phrase from German sociology, distinguishes between what he calls religion on the one hand and religiosity on the other. And to speak simplistically, but I think accurately, for Buber, religiosity is a very good thing, and religion is a very problematic thing. Religiosity is what emerges from an ever-renewing sense of wonder and adoration. It is totally free and spontaneous from within us. Religion, in contrast, is what happens when moments of religiosity become set, established, and inherited practice. In other words, put this very concretely, Moses has an encounter with God and does something as a response to that moment. That's religiosity. 3,000 years later, we're still copying him. That's religion. Now, Buber acknowledges, he sort of gestures towards the possibility that, well, maybe sometimes religion and religiosity can exist together, and religion can even be helpful for religiosity, but let's be honest about that. That's not really the way it happens. Now you can imagine, this is not a lecture about Martin Buber, but you can imagine that this is a kind of deeply anti-traditionalist bent that Buber is articulating. Now, Heschel is in a sense reacting to exactly that dichotomy. He is well aware, right? There's nothing naive here. He is well aware that religion can actually function to undermine and even destroy authentic religious devotion and practice. As he famously said to a group of rabbis in the 1950s, the temple has become the graveyard where prayer is buried. Right? The temple has become the graveyard where prayer is buried. He is under no illusions about the reality of religion, especially as he sees it in North America. It can deaden the spirit. But, he insists, that the death of authentic religiosity is not the inevitable consequence of religion, but actually a result of the corruption and dilution of religion. That's, in some sense, the fundamental divide between Buber and Heschel. Buber says, this is an inevitable consequence. You set up religion, you kill religiosity. Heschel says, no, you set up religion in the hopes of cultivating religiosity. Footnote, but it very often does go off the rails. And so one of my jobs, Heschel's job, as any religious teacher, is to revitalize that living dynamic as opposed to contributing to the deadening dynamic. There is a crucial point here that will enable us to get started in really understanding Heschel. For Buber, I think, modern men and women need to break free from the shackles of inherited tradition so that we can again worship God and respond to the world, to God and to others, freely and responsibly. For Heschel, in contrast, modern men and women need to be saved from the callousness and indifference that modernity induces in us. We're going to talk at length about how modernity does that in his mind. And one of the central functions of religion is precisely to help us come to life again and overcome that callousness and indifference. In other words, for Heschel, religious tradition holds out a legacy of wonder that has the potential to elicit and awaken our own. The wonder we receive when we say every day, Mi chamocha ba'elim Hashem, who is like you among God? When we say Psukei de Zimra, which admire God's creation, in theory, those texts, those liturgical performances, those moments of tefillah are supposed to function to awaken our own sense of wonder. It is on that possibility, he thinks, this is a very dramatic sentence, but I think it's actually important and accurate to understanding. It is on that possibility that the future and survival of humanity depends. That's Heschel's argument. The reigniting of wonder, we're going to spend a long time trying to understand why. The reigniting of wonder in human beings is nothing less than what the future of humanity depends on. So wonder. Let's think a little bit about wonder. According to Heschel, all human beings have a natural proclivity to wonder, a sense of what he calls, at one point, unmitigated innate surprise. We look at the world and we are perpetually surprised by it. A sense of wonder, of amazement, of appreciation is constitutive of who and what we are as human beings. In other words, in English, part of what it means to be human is to have a sense of wonder. Now, I don't want to talk about this now. If it's kind of useful during the Q&A, we'll talk about this. I would be curious if I had asked you before tonight, and especially if you've never read Heschel before, tell me the 100 most important words in Judaism's spiritual vocabulary. How many of you would have said wonder, or in Hebrew, pele? I'm not certain what the answer is, and I think it's interesting, right? It's a surprising choice on which to build, in certain levels, on which to build the entire edifice of Jewish spirituality, and for that matter, in his argument, human spirituality. I want to emphasize, though, that it's easy to misunderstand what wonder is. Wonder for Heschel is not an emotion, and it is certainly not an experience. Wonder is an attitude, or what I pretentiously call an existential posture. It is a way of holding myself in the world. It is an orientation to life. More, and perhaps surprisingly for some people, Heschel also claims that all religious awareness and insight are rooted in or dependent on this core orientation to the world of wonder. If you look for a moment at source 2, I'm actually not going to read all the sources out loud, but source 2 is an interesting kind of articulation of it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about why wonder dies, and then go back and try and unpack a little about what it is that wonder actually is. The problem in the modern world, according to Heschel, and it's not actually only the modern world, but the modern world exacerbates it, is that routinization is a kind of spiritual poison. The more I do something regularly, the more my sense of wonder and appreciation collapse. I remember in one of the most self-righteous moments of my life, and that is really saying something. One of the most self-righteous moments of my life. I walked into work one day, I was working at Harvard Law, and I walked into the kitchen, and I said to the chef, "How's it going?" And he said, "Same stuff, different day." He didn't use the word stuff. And I had this impulse, which thankfully I was able to maintain, saying, "New stuff, different day," right? That's what Heschel's talking about. There's no such thing as same stuff. No such thing. And yet, the dulling of wonder by routine is sort of the nature of human life to some degree. We become desensitized by the ways our lives develop routine. Which, by the way, I would add as a footnote, paradoxically, we also need in order to function and maintain our sanity. That's what's complicated here. One of the central tasks of worship and liturgy is precisely to resensitize us, to, in a way, defamiliarize us with the world, to renew our sense of surprise. And if you look at source 3, you will see Heschel say exactly that. If you will take 1 second and just look at it, every evening we recite, he creates light and makes the dark. Twice a day we say he is one. What is the meaning of such repetition? A scientific theory, once it is announced and accepted, does not have to be repeated twice a day. The insights of wonder must be constantly kept alive. Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is a need for daily worship. That sentence is extremely important to Heschel. Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is a need for daily worship. We will talk about this in the final session, but one of the things you can already imagine here is, if you ask Heschel what's the core of prayer, the answer is not asking God for what I need. The answer is learning to appreciate what there is. It's very, very important to him. Now, I want to just underline, that is the central task of religion when it works. And, you know, we should bold and capitalize that, when it works, which is a huge copy. Now, a couple of things about definition. It is very common, rabbis will often speak this way, some of Heschel's academic interpreters speak this way too, to assume that in Heschel there are two terms that are synonyms, wonder and radical amazement. I think they are not synonyms, and I want to just sort of say something about what I think the distinction is, because it's interesting just to help think about for a moment. Wonder is responding to the world with a sense of surprise. Radical amazement is looking at the world, being surprised by it, and then being surprised by the fact that I'm capable of being surprised. Radical amazement, in other words, as my former student Ilana Pershan said to me many years ago, radical amazement is reflexive wonder. Radical amazement is a radical intensification of wonder. Let's try to say that one more way. All moments of radical amazement are moments of wonder, but not all moments of wonder are moments of radical amazement. Now, I need to issue the following caveat for me. Heschel is guilty of what philosophers like to call linguistic slippage. That is, not always so careful about how he uses words, and terms often get effaced. You can find sentences in Heschel that seem an awful lot like wonder and radical amazement are synonyms, and yet there are a variety of places where I think he makes clear that radical amazement refers to something more extreme. Another way of saying this is, I think Heschel wants us to go through life with a sense of wonder, to the extent that we can pull this off all the time. But we can't go through life in a permanent state of radical amazement, because no one would ever make lunch. Because wonder is like a low voltage awareness, and radical amazement is like a higher voltage religious experience. By definition, it's fleeting, it's ephemeral, it fades. And it needs to in order for me to function in the world. But wonder, I think he thinks, doesn't ever have to fade. Because as I said, wonder is not an experience. It's a way of seeing and engaging the world. Now, it's crucial to say, wonder is not acquired by or defended on the basis of fear of science. And you can look at source 5, where Heschel wants to make the point that wonder does not depend on ignorance, and wonder is never the same as looking at something and saying, I don't understand this, let me figure it out, and then my wonder will dissipate. Wonder is, he says in source 6, and this is crucial, a form of thinking. It is a way of seeing the world. And Heschel is quick to emphasize, this is a little bit of a kind of cheap rhetorical point, but it's an interesting point. He says, you know, it's only popular science writers who basically imagine that science means the death of wonder. But real scientists understand that science only elicits wonder. Now, I understand that that is not an empirical description. It's more of a value judgment he's making. Let me give you an example of what Heschel would disapprove of. In a book called Unweaving the Rainbow, a man named Richard Dawkins says the following, quote, "The mystic is content to bask in the wonder and revel in a mystery that we were not meant to understand. The scientist feels the same wonder but is restless, not content, recognizes the mystery as profound, and then adds, but we're working on it." Dawkins, this is me talking, not Heschel obviously, at once caricatures the mystic as if the endurance of wonder depends on ignorance, and unselfconsciously portrays the scientist as hopelessly, unbearably self-satisfied, right? It's crucial to Heschel to demolish the assumption, ironically often shared by some of the most passionately religious and some of the most passionately anti-religious people in the world, that wonder depends on or is synonymous with ignorance. In other words, let me say this in one other way, without attempting not to get lost in the world of the science and religion dialogue. Heschel is not talking about what philosophers call the God of the gaps. The God of the gaps is a way people talk about a variety of theologians who say, well, where is God? God is in all the holes of scientific understanding. Problem is, the gaps keep closing. Right? That's fool's gold to believe in the God of the gaps. God is not imagined in the holes of scientific understanding, but in the amazement at the fact that there is anything at all. And that's the core meaning of wonder, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. By the way, the God of the gaps, people who are adherents of that view don't describe themselves that way, but a really interesting contemporary example of that is the theory of intelligent design, which is an insistent attempt to reinsert a gap in what the mainstream of science believes it has solved. Right? The mainstream of science believes, right, that natural selection can explain the evolution of everything, more or less. And ID basically says, oh yeah, but what about this, and what about that, and what about this, and what about that? That is an attempt to reinsert the God of the gaps. Okay? That's a really good contemporary example of what Heschel doesn't want to do. In other words, and here we're actually getting to what I think is probably the most helpful understanding of wonder, it is not so much specific fact that we're supposed to feel wonder, that we're supposed to react to with wonder, but rather, as Heschel puts it, at the fact that there are facts at all. Wonder is a response to the fact that there are facts at all. To put it somewhat more philosophically, for Heschel, religious awareness is born in the moment when I discover the sheer contingency of being. None of this had to be, and yet it is. Or, to borrow a phrase most commonly associated with Martin Heidegger, why is there something rather than nothing? That is the foundational religious awareness for Heschel. Why is there something rather than nothing? Religion is a response, Heschel says, to use his phrase again, to the unexpectedness of being as such. But here's the thing, now you can make this very concrete. How often in the course of a busy day on the Upper West Side, I understand that there are actually neighborhoods outside of the Upper West Side, but that's Shamanti, you know, how often do you stop in the midst of a crazed day to have a moment of realization? None of this had to be. It's all, and you can choose your word depending on your orientation. It's all a wonder, it's all a miracle, it's all a mystery. None of this had to be. And religion, he thinks, depends on reigniting that awareness. In other words, this is in contrast to many popularizations of Heschel. Wonder doesn't mean I look at this thing or I look at that thing and I think, oh, that's amazing. It means I look at being, at the fact that there's a world at all. Now, Heschel believes that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, contains, it is, as he puts it at one point, our question is in essence an answer in disguise. Once we ask that question, we are already suggesting that we experience the world as a gift, Now, here I want to stop and say I am aware that the philosophers in the room, you don't have to be a professional philosopher to be helpful, can begin to point to places where there are some leaps here that are not obvious, okay? And I'd be happy to talk about them a little bit more later on. In any case, the notion associated, for example, with the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell, what do you mean, why is there something rather than nothing? The world is a brute fact. And Heschel would say, it's a very calloused way of seeing the world. What do you mean the world is a brute fact? Why can't I ask one more question about the world? Why can't I keep going with that question? Now, what's the relationship of this to worshiping God? What's the relationship between wonder and belief in God? And I underline here the words for Heschel, because there's some very distinct ways in which Heschel, I think, is not so aware of the ways in what that he's talking here in a very distinctively Jewish idiom. He's not aware of how Jewish this idiom is. I'm happy to talk about this a little more during the Q&A. In general, I think that for Heschel, wonder constitutes a kind of, to use philosophy speak for a minute, pre-apprehension of God. By pre-apprehension, I simply mean this. We don't necessarily have a conscious, explicit awareness of God when we have wonder, but we do, or again, so Heschel thinks, have some faint glimmerings of something beyond that is responsible for all this. Now, it's crucial. For many reasons for Heschel, it's crucial, but I want to make this point clear. This is not an inference. There is no moment in Heschel in which he thinks, the world is amazing, therefore there must be a God. It's not an argument. It's an intuition. That is, he believes that in our very awareness of wonder, already we have some sense of God. Now, when that awareness of God but goes from being unconscious to conscious, goes from being implicit to explicit, that's called awe. I'm now doing something that may not be possible. I'm trying to define terms as they appear in the first part of God in Search of Man. This is a notoriously difficult thing to do, and I'm trying to do it as best I can. If you go home tonight and spend the entire night reading God in Search of Man, you will find sentences that appear to say different things than what I'm saying. I'm trying to read based on the majority of times Heschel uses these terms. This is what I think he's saying. Awe equals wonder plus conscious reference to God. Awe is already an explicitly religious feeling. Whereas wonder contains an implicit reference to God, again, awe contains explicit reference to God. So we have these three terms, wonder, radical amazement, and awe. And there's one more term I want to introduce, and then we can think about where all this might lead us in Heschel's mind. The fourth term is the mystery. What's key for Heschel is that the term mystery does not describe something about our human consciousness, but rather something about the world. If you look at source 7, you will see Heschel say, what the sense of the ineffable perceives is something objective, which cannot be conceived by the mind nor captured by imagination or feeling. Okay? And as he puts it in a couple sentences later, subjective is the manner, not the matter of our perception. Now, this is a statement, not an argument. I want to be clear about that, even if Heschel wasn't. And we can talk more about that later. The argument, in other words, is when I have a sense of wonder, I am responding to something real about the world and not just describing my internal experience. This is the great, you can call this the great kind of epistemological anxiety, the great anxiety of modern philosophy. If I talk about my own experience, how do I ever know I'm talking about anything beyond my own head? That's the great anxiety of all kinds of philosophy. They start naming names. Feuerbach in religion is the most famous one. Right? Heschel wants to override that anxiety by saying, of course I'm talking about something outside my awareness. We talk about whether that's, I can imagine responses ranging from, that's obviously true, to how on earth can you just say that, to all kinds of things in between. But that's what the claim is. Heschel wants to sort of override the kind of epistemological anxiety that says, oh, I just had the most amazing perception in the world, but probably it's just about the top of my own head. I just summarized a tremendous amount of 300 years of modern philosophy in that sentence, by the way, which may strike people as idiotic, but a tremendous number of careers have been made trying to figure out whether we are not, in fact, brains and vats, right? You know, any idea what I'm talking about? That's the classic freshman introduction to epistemology. How do I know I'm not a brain in a vat, right? Heschel, like many 20th century philosophers, would say, you know what? You people need day jobs. We'll talk about that, okay? We'll talk about that. And yet, the mystery is not God. This is important for him. The mystery is not God. The mystery points to God. In other words, something about the world strikes us as mysterious, is in fact mysterious, and that is a kind of allusion to God. Allusion. Here's the argument, essentially. Here's the spiritual perception, in a way, that underlies a lot of Heschel's worldview. So we can kind of go from this sort of abstract philosophical language and say this. None of this had to be, and all of it alludes to something beyond it. None of this had to be, and all of it alludes to something beyond it. Everything in the world is an allusion to something transcendent. In good Heschelian speak, he says at one point, the world is replete with indicativeness, meaning it's all pointing to something. In our contemporary world, talking about the world pointing to God trips many people up. It's not as obvious to many people as it was to Heschel. And again, we can maybe talk about that later. So I should stop here and clarify the world for Heschel is an allusion to God, but it is not God. And many people get lost here, especially in our, what I would call, our contemporary pantheistic moment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So, in other words, Heschel is vituperatively opposed to all ideas that you can say that God is the world, or the world is God. After all, that's the meaning of Genesis 1. God creates the world, which is not God. The world is not God, and God is not the world. That is said, for example, in source 9. I gave you one example of that from God in Search of Man. In other words, when something alludes to something else, it is not that something else. Okay, so it's very fundamental to Heschel that although God is radically immanent and present in the world, God is also fundamentally transcendent and beyond the world. Okay. So where does wonder lead us? And why is all this religiously important? And how could I possibly say at the beginning that for Heschel the future of humanity and its survival depends on this? Because for many of us, I think the term wonder suggests a kind of aesthetic feeling. Right? Wonder is the kind of thing I might feel looking at a Picasso. But what does that have to do with the future of humanity and the history of the 20th century? And here is where I think Heschel becomes interesting as, you know what, let me back up. This is where I think Heschel makes what is an interesting argument that is more than theological. It is actually a kind of moral philosophical argument. Whether or not it's totally convincing, I leave it to your judgment. Wonder, for Heschel, is, as he puts it, not a state of aesthetic enjoyment. On the contrary, wonder always, an authentic sense of wonder, always carries within it a challenge. Or as he puts it in one place, endless wonder is endless tension. Because wonder, end of the quote, wonder awakens us to a sense that, and this is probably the sentence that appears in his writing more than any other, something is asked of us. The sense of wonder, so he argues, comes with a sense that something is asked of us. When I experience the world, when I regard the world as a wonder, I begin to wonder, I've been given a gift, what do I owe? Or as he puts it at one point, the religious awareness is about owingness rather than owningness, something like that, right? An orientation to a sense of owing. And that question, he is quick to point out, quote, demands our whole being as an answer. What is asked of us is not a question for sophomore philosophy class. It's a question for how do I carry myself in the world? What is the meaning of my life? How do I function? And I want to emphasize here, and this is the beginning of our lecture, of our link to next week's talk, that this sense that something is asked of us is, for Heschel, the portal in human experience that opens us to the possibility of receiving revelation, of being interested in the question of what are God's commands. This is the portal in human life, the sense that he believes, okay, underline it, he believes is universal, and that is actually not that hard to access if we're willing to open our eyes, the sense that we've been giving something, and that something is asked of us at the same time. Wonder, in other words, is closely entwined for Heschel with a sense of what he calls indebtedness. And you could see sources 11 and 12 are examples of that. How shall we ever reciprocate for breathing and thinking? This is a sentence, is that in the packet? Yeah. How shall we ever reciprocate for breathing and thinking, for sight and hearing, for love and achievement? Let me translate that into biblical language. Ma'ashiv ladonai kol tagmulo yalai. How can I possibly repay God for all that I've been given? According to Heschel, a sense of indebtedness, this is really interesting. We are now at war with Descartes and everything that comes after him if you're a philosopher. A sense of indebtedness is a constitutive feature of what it means to be a human being. Or as he puts it, to eradicate indebtedness would be to destroy what is human in man. To eradicate a sense that I owe something would be to eradicate that which makes me human. Or as he puts it at one point, I believe, am I getting this right? I am commanded, therefore I am. Now, I'm going to try to explain in a minute why this is a war on an awful lot of modern philosophy. But let me say first something that may be useful. And now we're in kind of social criticism. Heschel argues consistently in his writing that there are two ways of being in the world, two orientations to the world. What he calls the way of wonder on the one hand, and what he calls the way of expediency on the other. The distinction is really fundamental to what he's trying to do as a thinker and to his understanding of religion and its role in healing the horrors of the world. So let's just sort of stay with this for a moment. You can look at source 12, if it's useful. The way of expediency means, but let's just translate that into more kind of obvious language. The way of expediency is the way of self-interest. The way of expediency, we accumulate information in order to dominate. In the way of wonder, we deepen our appreciation in order to respond. The way of expediency, of self-interest, closes us off to what is outside us. Everything outside me becomes something that can serve me. The way of wonder, in contrast, awakens me to the reality of living in what he calls the great fellowship of all beings. We all come from the same place. What this means, and I think this is the basic claim that underlies all of Heschel's theology and spirituality. I know that's a bold statement. It's the argument of my book about Heschel. It's wrong. That for Heschel, all of life is essentially a struggle between self-assertion, that's the way of expediency on the one hand, and self-transcendence, which is a way of wonder on the other. Another formulation, Heschel said there are two impulses in the human being. The impulse to acquire, to enjoy, to possess, that's expediency. And the urge to respond, to yield, to give, that's the way of wonder. The argument that I make about Heschel is that self-transcendence is the very heart of Heschel's theology and spirituality. We'll talk about this in all of the lectures, but especially again in the fifth. And self-transcendence, if it sounds like an abstract term, here's what I think it means. Caring about, in genuine and deep way, selves other than my own. Or, as he puts it in various writings, having transitive concern as opposed to merely reflexive concern. Reflexive concern, that is, concern with myself, all organic matter has that. Plants, too, are kind of set up to try and survive. What it means to become human is to have transitive concern. To care about other self. And the argument, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, that Heschel makes, is that almost the definition of God, there is no definition of God, but almost the definition of God in biblical theology is pure transitive concern. God loves widows and orphans, or in a favorite sentence that I've had a hard time finding recently in Heschel, but I quote all the time, Zeus loves women, but God loves widows. God who cares about other selves. Crucially, human beings do have, and this is the argument, human beings do have the capacity to choose self-transcendence. Quote Heschel again, the grand premise of religion is that man is able to surpass himself. This is not the same way, this is not to say that we often do that. It's to say that we can. I'm tempted to go on a little riff here about, which I've said on many occasions in this room, but in some ways that's the difference between much of Christian theology and much mature Jewish theology. right? Much of Christian theology is premised on the notion the tragedy of human life is that we can't possibly respond to God's will. The tragedy of Jewish theology is that we can respond to God's will, and we continually don't. They are different forms of imagining the tragedy of human life. Okay? Heschel is a Jewish theologian in that and many other ways. Descriptively, of course, religion can feed and stoke all of our worst impulses. But prescriptively, its job is to cultivate our good ones. Or, if you look at source 13, the will to power and the will to believe are mutually exclusive. One of the sort of boldest sentences, right? The will to power and the will to believe are mutually exclusive. For in our striving for power, we arrogate to ourselves what belongs to God and suppress the claim of God's presence. To put it simply, God's presence is a call to self-transcendence. What it means to believe in God is to value and care for selves other than my own. Wonder makes us realize that we are not in charge and that our egos are not the center of the universe. Because, let me say, this is now Scheinheld speak, not Heschel speak, but it might be useful here. When you truly have cultivated a sense of wonder, it is no longer possible for I to be the first word that you speak. It's impossible, because you are aware at every moment of your life, I am not the author of any of this. That, I have argued in print, is why in Jewish literature we say modeh ani and not ani modeh, right? Grateful am I and not I am grateful. If I got up in the morning, the first word I said was I would be recapitulating everything that is horrific about most of us. Not people in this room, but humans, right? And modeh ani is about saying, no, grateful first, okay? Now, what all this yields is a very different conception of self, but also a very different experience of myself. Or as Heschel puts it wonderfully, the mystery is not here, the mystery is not there while we are here. The truth is that we are all steeped in it, imbibed with it. We are partly it. Think of Descartes for a moment. Freshman philosophy Descartes. I don't have to be like an expert in Descartes, which I have no pretense of being. We talk about a sovereign, autonomous self who doubts everything except for the existence of his own self, and then tries to build a world out from there. Heschel says, that is wrong in every conceivable way. Before I ask any question, I am already aware that something is asked of me. Or as he puts it, I have neither initiated nor conceived the worth and meaning of my life. The essence of what I am is not mine. Now, Heschel's italics, I am what is not mine. I am what is not mine. Cartesian philosophy, in other words, is a form of self-assertion. It's a way of constructing an entire philosophy on the assumption that the very first thing I can say, and the only thing I can say without any doubt, is I. It asserts the self, and then questions everything else. But true self-transcendence rejects all of these premises. It begins with God and questions the self. Or as Heschel loves to say, philosophy asks a question about God, religion asks a question from God. I'm not doing the asking, I'm being asked. God is the asker and we are the asked. God is the thinker and we are the thought of. God is the subject and we are the object of God's knowledge and thought. Now, why is the modern world such a nightmare? And then maybe I'll end with that. This is Heschel talking, not me. This is Heschel talking, not me. Okay? Because the gods of baseball hate us. I recently got a letter from a friend of mine in Israel who actually said, the fact that you, given what you talk about theologically, could at the same time be an impassioned Yankee fan is a contradiction that I find it stunning to believe you don't think about. Not that I don't think about it. It's that I believe that some teams were elected by God. Now, where Heschel asks, has the modern world gone off the rails? Instead of cultivating a sense of appreciation for the sheer wondrousness of being, modern people simply, this is the beginning of it, take the world for granted, and what is worse, and here's the distinctively modern piece, so the argument goes, treat it as little more than a vast reservoir of information and opportunity for exploitation. We treat the world as a toolbox. How can this serve me? Source 14, our age is one in which usefulness is thought to be the chief merit of nature. Man has become primarily a tool-making animal, and the world is now a gigantic toolbox for the satisfaction of his needs. In other words, we live in a culture that is all about expediency, where the way of expediency has crowded out the way of wonder almost altogether. This is not so different in a way from what Martin Buber means when he talks about the it world crowding out the thou world. They are very close. The modern question, in other words, is not, as it ought to be, says Heschel, how can I respond, but rather, how can I use this? That is a distinctive question of modernity. How can I use this? Or, in my idiom, how can this serve me? At one point, Heschel writes, we teach children how to measure, how to weigh. We fail to teach them how to revere, how to sense wonder and awe. So there are, in other words, at least in my interpretation of Heschel, two steps in the death of wonder. First, as we saw, there's routinization. That takes place always by nature of being alive. And then, much worse and more dangerously, there's modernity's contribution, which is what we'll call instrumentalization, turning everything into something that is there for me to use. People worship at the altar of expediency. The only question that interests them very often is, how can I use this? A contemporary scholar of Martin Heidegger points out, I wasn't going to say this, but it just struck me at this moment, that even contemporary American lingo works this way. We don't talk about people anymore, we talk about human resources. We don't talk about words, we talk about word processing as if words were really just a tool to use. And it goes on and on, all these lists of the way we use the word resource, which is exactly a word that Martin Heidegger warned dramatically against. Now, the fact that I'm talking about Heschel and Heidegger in the same breath, I will explain in a moment. I want to make something, though, explicitly clear here about Heschel. So, well, it should be clear already, but the danger posed by the collapse of wonder is not primarily aesthetic. He cares about that, but not that much. It's rather ethical and theological. The decline of wonder spells the end of a sense for the transcendent, and in turn, this means, says Heschel, that modern human beings don't feel called or compelled by anything outside the self. That's why he says, famously, and this should have been on your sheet, one of the most important sentences of Heschel that people don't really ever stop thinking about what this actually means, as opposed to being a good line. Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin. Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin. That means, in other words, when I don't have any sense of appreciation of anything or anyone beyond me, I can do whatever I please. The argument, in other words, is that wonder is a radically ethical category. Or as he puts it at one point, forfeit your sense of awe, let your conceit diminish your ability to revere, and the universe becomes a marketplace for you. Or, in another context, quote, a civilization that is devoted exclusively to the utilitarian is at bottom not different from barbarism. The culture of I, the iPod, the iPad, the I everything. It is in this relentless self-assertion that has made us unprecedentedly callous, he argues. It has made unprecedented callousness and cruelty possible, and that's what brings us to such unimaginable devastation. And I didn't talk about Heschel's biography, simply in the interest of time, but this is a person whose entire world is destroyed by the Holocaust. Now, there is an irony in the transition from that sentence to this one. There is a lot of echo here, for those of you who are interested in philosophy, in echoes of Martin Heidegger's famous critique of technology, right? Which is, what happens when literally you see a river and the only thing you think is, oh, the tourism industry could really use this well, right? What happens? Now, some of you have sired aspiring Heidegger scholars, but I want to just say in passing, Heidegger's concern here is not primarily ethical. It has to do with a somewhat wacky preoccupation with the nature of being, right? For Heschel, the issue is radically ethics and theology. I think there are sentences in Heschel. It's clear that he is aware of Heidegger. It is also clear that he wants not to cite Heidegger because Heidegger was arguably one of the worst human beings of the 20th century, right? Basically, in many ways, an unrepentant Nazi. And Heschel, like many others, will not sort of, except for late in his life where he explicitly writes a critique of Heidegger, he will not acknowledge the places where Heidegger is influencing his thought. But that critique is not unique to Heschel. It's a common critique in mid-20th century philosophy and theology. This notion that modernity has gone off the rails because all we think about is how can I use this. So reorientation is necessary, radical reorientation, so that we realize that life is not about claims I make so much as it is about claims made upon me. And I don't really have the time to say this in any length here, but I think one of the most interesting arguments Heschel makes is that he only makes this in passing, we totally misconstrue freedom. Right? We think freedom is actually the capacity to pursue what we want, but authentic freedom is only realized in moments of self-transcendence. Now, this is me talking for a second, because we in America very often confuse freedom as the right to pursue our impulses. Right? And Heschel, here in the tradition of philosophy, wants to argue that's not freedom at all, it's just another form of enslavement. Now, this systematic reorientation is arguably, so he says, what is most distinctive about religion, which is why it is so urgent and indispensable if humanity is to overcome our imprisonment in the culture of expediency. That's why religion is such an urgent need. And recall what I said earlier, right? Okay. I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to say this anyway, even though I wasn't planning to. There is something very mid-20th century about some of the ways Heschel talks about this. It makes a lot of sense in a culture where the enemy is, quote, godless communism, and when it is assumed that Nazism should be understood more or less as a secular phenomenon, right? That latter claim has been largely kind of moved away from in historiography since then. And also in a world in which the primary enemy your culture faces is radical Islam, not godless communism, right? The question becomes, is the problem with the world's ethics too little God? That's the argument that Heschel wants to make, right? The reason humanity is out of control is that there is too little God. Difficult sentence to say in the 21st century. It was much easier to say that in 1955. It culturally made more sense. And there's much we could say about that. But at very least, we should notice that it's historically located. Okay? Now, I want to say one last thing about this expediency thing, and then I'll stop and say one closing sentence and skip the rest of what I was going to say. See if it comes up before the mass exodus. The danger is also that when we see the entire world as a tool, we eventually, inevitably see ourselves the same way. We become enslaved to the very things we seek to enslave. Right? No one ever became free by going through life asking, how can I use this? So the argument goes. It's like a kind of boomerang. When we try to turn the whole world into a technology, we ourselves become little more than objects. I read recently an argument by a contemporary American moral philosopher that at first I thought was actually a piece from The Onion, where he makes the argument that one of the liberations of modernity is that we can see our bodies as mere tools to get us our satisfaction and what we want. And I mean, honestly, I thought it was a parody when I first read it. Someone makes this argument in the first decade of the 21st century. But so the argument goes. Now, I want to make this clear. The argument is not that technology is bad. The argument is that the technological way of seeing the world is bad. That's a very important difference. Heschel is not a Luddite. He does not think we should move back into tents. But he does think that seeing the world only through this lens, and this is actually straight Heidegger, seeing the world in this way is extremely dangerous. Now, Heschel, for radical ethical and theological reasons. That's the addition. Okay? Even religion, Heschel points out, we manage to turn into a tool to serve us. Why am I frum? Because, let's give some answers. Well, I want Olam Haba, right? I want to go on living forever. And not only that, I want to feel really good about myself, right? I want to feel that God loves me and chose me. So I can go on living my bourgeois life, feeling totally great. Yeah, other people are suffering terribly. Hey, it's fine, but like, I'm sure it's what I'm sure. This is like a very, very fundamental claim he wants to make, right? Religion, too, becomes just a tool for our own satisfaction. And not only that, in philosophy, God becomes a tool for our own satisfaction. What is God in most modern philosophy? An answer to my philosophical problems. Oh, I don't know how to keep my moral philosophy going. I will posit a postulate called God. That's not the God of Israel. The God of Israel is a God who radically interrupts every assumption I have and says, where are you? Right? But even religion and even God become tools for my own satisfaction. So in other words, is God an answer to my question, or am I asked to be an answer to God's? That is, for the philosophy heads in the room, the critique of ontotheology in Heidegger's view. In other words, wonder forces us to recognize that we are not the only source and judge of value in the world. And the collapse of wonder, so he says, can only have perilous consequences, otherwise known as the 20th century. A world without wonder is a world, he says, that is devoid of self-transcendence, and thus also a world closed off to the presence of God. Here's my last sentence. We are capable, Heschel argues, of having this kind of pre-apprehension of God, that's wonder, that can mature into awe, but we can't really know who God is without what he calls guidance. And that's the argument in his kind of structure of Judaism of where revelation comes in. Because wonder leaves me with two questions. This is now me trying to interpret it, but I think this is accurate. Two questions. Something is asked of us, what and by whom? Next week, we're going to talk about revelation, that is an attempt to answer the question of what. And in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about God, which is an attempt to answer the question of by whom. Stop there. Thank you. Okay, floor is open. Julie, yes, please.
First of all, thank you. This is wonderful. The question I have is there any room for Heschel for self-assertion, the way that there is, say, in Soloveitchik? And if there is, how does he accommodate that, or does he have recommendations, suggestions for how one operates that way ethically?
Yeah, so I think I'll answer this, and then we'll take maybe a little. Thank you. The answer is, I think Heschel thinks that some degree of self-assertion is necessary in order for us to function as organic life. We have to seek out food, we have to seek out shelter. And he famously dissents from the Kutzke-Rebbe, who's one of his heroes, by saying, okay, you know, we can critique selfishness, but we don't have to despise ourselves. That's not what I'm talking about. In fact, as he wonderfully says in God in Search of Man, if it was really such a sin to have a self-suicide, would be a mitzvah, right? That's not what I'm arguing, right? I am making space for a self. I'm just talking about what I would call the paradox of a self that transcends itself, right? A self that is focused on other things. So yes, I think there is. The question is, and this is where I think he would begin to push at many of our comfort zones, just how much self? I mean, I could imagine Heschel saying, yeah, you want to have a savings account? That's fine, but how big? How big? You're confident that that's moral? Right? I know I'm not directly answering your question, but I'm trying to sort of point to how I think he would begin to want us to think about it. Which is, yeah, there's room for self. But the problem is, in the modern world especially, right, we say, oh, there is room for self, and then, like, all bets are off. And there's no limits to acquisitiveness. And so I think he wants to find a way to, like, yeah, you can have a self. But I think what he doesn't do, right, there's no discussion in Heschel of, okay, how much is too much? And part of that is because, you know, there's really two modes of Jewish ethical writing. It's probably true about other religious traditions too. But something that a scholar, philosopher named Dan Breslauer has argued many times, right? There's a kind of Jewish ethicist who says, okay, I'm going to mine classical Jewish ethical sources, halachic material, and try to articulate concrete answers to very distinctive moral questions. How much money am I allowed to have? Then there's a different kind of ethicist who's really interested in the orientation of a human being to the world and life, and I'm going to talk about kind of big picture. How do I situate myself in the world? Heschel is the latter very much, and not the former. A more Jewish way of saying that is, he's not a posek on those kind of questions, right? He's really not. And maybe that's a limitation of his thought, but he doesn't do that.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up, or maybe not so quick? I think I was asking less in terms of his relationship or his thinking about material possessions, but more of a notion of, I can operate in the world wanting self-actualization,
Right, okay.
right? In terms of what is my relationship to building, to creating, to inventing new technologies, to what he may discuss as domination, but one might also see as that's in some ways the purpose of human existence.
Good. So let me say two quick things in response, and then I'll take a round of questions. Okay? One is, there's a very interesting, Man is Not Alone. One of Heschel's most famous books is an attempt to make what I think is a very interesting argument that is an attempt, I think, among other things, to respond to what you're asking, but not fully. So that's what I'll say the second thing. Heschel makes the argument that human beings, by nature, need to be needed. Everyone who's honest with themselves will admit, on some level, that I need to be needed. He says, theology is amazing in this way, because you know what Tanakh teaches? I'm needed by the ultimate. God is in search of man. So self-fulfillment and service are the very same thing. That's the subversive claim, right? Now, I am needed, and that is the meaning of my life. How can I find a way to respond to the divine? That said, there is not an emphasis in the way that you are, in a way, pointing to on human creativity as a virtue in and of itself. The 20th century Jewish thinker who's most preoccupied with that is Joseph Soloveitchik, right? For Rabbi Soloveitchik, deeply influenced by existentialism, right? It's all about creativity, and one could argue, certainly in Halachic Man, that there's actually not a lot of bridle on that, not a lot of limits to it, till later. Yeah, that's not Heschel's idiom. And I think there would be a very interesting dialogue there. An interesting kind of historical thing about this is that Soloveitchik thought that human beings going to space was like the coolest thing in the world, and Heschel was extremely religiously anxious about it. Right? It was just kind of about not understanding that there should be limits. And you could forget about the case, but there's something interesting about the two of them in that context. Let me take three questions, and then I'll try to, let's try to make them relatively fast, just because.
I get what you're saying about the critique of instrumental rationality, but on that basis, how can you how does Heschel, or how is it possible to reconcile an idea of like experiencing wonder through an kind of immanent and simultaneously transcendent God, if you're looking at kind of the wonder of like the being of things? Because you're not looking at beingness, right? You see wonder in the beingness of things, and so then how can that be coherently understood within a critique like of I don't know, Adorno-like stuff?
Okay, thank you for letting me easy let her question. Yeah.
I'm feeling a sense of tension between this cultivated sense of knowingness from wonder and the experience of suffering. And wondering if is there an underlying assumption that suffering has to be transcended always, or if there is an experience of suffering that is so great that it can't be transcended to others?
Great question. Wow. The fourth lecture is going to be about that. I'm going to try in the fourth lecture to give what is like a kind of totally revisionist reading of Heschel's understanding of the place of the Shoah and the place of the Shoah in Jewish theology. People often think that Heschel sort of thinks that his theology solves that problem. It's wildly wrong, and it tries to make space for lament as a religious value. We're not going to come to that. Okay? Yes, please.
Is Heschel's perception of wonder the same thing as what would be called in meditation awareness?
Great. Okay, let me take a couple more.
In Soloveitchik, we see the response to creativity as it is nurtured by halacha, and I wonder in Heschel what nurtures or what cultivates the wonder.
Okay. Let's take one more for now. Yeah, please.
I'd like to push back a little bit on something you said. It seems to me like Heschel only seems very mid-20th century compared to today if we see radical Islam as kind of the primary challenge that we face in the context of another challenge of kind of corporatism and using kind of ecological crisis, perhaps. That seems very much the same thing that he's talking about.
Okay, so let me say a couple of things. Miri, I'm thinking about your question. I may wait till tomorrow. Is wonder the same thing as awareness? So the answer is, I think, yes and no. Wonder has very basic similarities to awareness, but what's different about it is that for Heschel, and this may be kind of distinctively Western, and distinctively Western theological, in ways he did not fully acknowledge, it's not about bare awareness. It's that bare awareness includes within it the germ of awareness of God. So it's not pure mindfulness, or if you want to say it differently, right? The mindfulness, now this is an imperialistic sentence, I recognize that. Authentic mindfulness, right, contains within it already an awareness of something transcendent. Now this is very culturally located in the following way, right? I could imagine sitting down with a Vipassana meditation teacher, showing him this book, and having him say, okay, wonder. You didn't wonder God thing. You didn't do that exactly, right? Now, Heschel really believes, and this is one of the ways in which, this will probably take me to the end of my time if I end a little early so you can, go watch with me statements. Heschel really believes that the intuition he's talking about is truly universal, and those who don't have it need to have it elicited. The problem is, right, that he does not seem aware of the fact, first of all, that the danger of a theology that's so heavily dependent on intuition is that many people have different intuitions, and people who have different intuitions are not necessarily to be categorized as morally culpable, right? And, let me put it another way, Heschel believes that there is a core universal human experience that is prior to any religious tradition, and religious tradition gives voice to it. What happened in the 1970s in philosophy, after he dies, is that whole idea completely fell apart. And what emerged is what was called hermeneutical theology, which is the idea that, wait a second, right? Culture already constitutes the very experiences I have. You can't get beneath and behind Judaism and say, I'm going to start with this universal pre-cultural awareness, and then lo and behold, Judaism gives voice to it. No, right? Your very experience is already formed by the culture in which you live. Now there are like very, I don't want to say cynical, but there are very like radical versions of that, like Richard Rorty. And then there are less radical versions of that, like many very traditionally oriented religious thinkers who all admit the fantasy of getting beneath culture is not doable. Heschel really had that fantasy. And he dies right before that idea in philosophy collapses. And so I think one of the things I think one has to do if one wants to keep Heschel like a vital voice in theology is admit that Heschel was doing something very, very, very powerful, which is somewhat other than he thought he was doing. Meaning he thought that in the beginning of God in Search of Man, he was articulating a pre-cultural, universal human sense of what wonder and awe are. And what he was doing was giving a breathtakingly eloquent, thick description of what it's like to experience wonder as a Jew. That's what theology does now. Very few people claim to be doing that first thing. This is related to, but not the same thing in philosophy, to the collapse of foundationalism. It's related, it's not the same thing. But so the answer to your question is, it's complicated. It's a very interesting question and a very important one. What if creativity is nurtured by halakha, according to Soloveitchik? That claim needs to be complicated too, because I would argue that most people don't understand what Soloveitchik means by halakha in those sentences, but we'll talk about that in another set of lectures, maybe. What nurtures the wonder? The first thing I think Heschel would say is prayer, right? And an orientation to prayer that is neither about rote recitation, nor about asking God to do stuff for me, but about actually orienting myself around awe and gratitude, right? And so in other words, it's actually saying the liturgy, but letting it do its work, as opposed to like, the danger of fixed liturgy, right? And not only danger of fixed liturgy where what you end up doing is every time someone adds something, it doesn't replace something else, right? So it's just a lot of words, right? So Heschel's nervous about that. But liturgy is the main way of doing it, but he thinks that in general, ritual life as structured by halakha, but I think he would say ritual life potentially in other contexts too, is about keeping us aware. Right? That is related in a way to mindfulness, but again, it's a theological mindfulness. Right? Why am I not, something that my teacher Yitz Greenberg likes to say, why am I not yotze when I make the wrong bracha on a food? Why am I not fulfilling my obligation? Because I'm supposed to actually be aware of what I'm eating. I'm supposed to know what that is. Right? And so, halakha, again, done right. What I'm about to say is going to sound deeply cynical, and I mean it the opposite, which is to say done the way Heschel is suggesting it be done, right, has the possibility of awakening that in us. Of course, Heschel is very nervous about the fact that what religion could do and what religion actually does there's some gap between those two things, right? And that's a gap that any religious thinker who's worth talking to is aware of, right? Now, the corporatism question. I don't really see that question as a challenge to the point about godless communism versus radical Islam. I think Heschel's response to you would be, in hachinami, in the language of Talmud, you're right. That is one of the great challenges. But I think he would argue, despite that, by the way, I'm about to say something that's going to sound deeply political, and I don't mean it to be. I'm making what I hope is an intellectual historical observation. The very odd marriage in the contemporary GOP between the kind of corporatism you're talking about and deeply politically conservative Christianity is odd. It's an odd and unnatural marriage. And I think Heschel would argue that the ethos of corporatism is fundamentally a result of secular modernity. Now, you can agree with that or not agree with that, but that's the argument he would make. It is about a world in which nothing is sacred. It is exactly what I'm talking about. Heschel, right? It is, everything's a tool. Everything's a tool. Everyone is a tool, right? But that is not, right, an argument against the need for theology at all. Because I think he would argue that religion taken seriously would shatter all of that discourse to shred. The notion that it can be married, right, to a kind of, preaching of the gospel makes no sense at all, I think he would argue. Right? It's an odd cultural formation. It's not easily understood. One more question, and then I'm going to end a tiny bit early. Hey, yes.
I was wondering,
Take two.
if you could talk a little bit more about the differentiation between wonder, which inspires worship in God, versus worship in nature. If both can
Worship in nature or worship of nature?
Worship of nature. If both can lead to a sense of ownness, and why is wonder at the vastness of the world not transcendent enough?
Good. Okay. Good. So I'm going to take one more, and that's going to be the last question. And then I'll say just a few sentences. I will butcher my answers to your question, and then.
Early on, you said one of the conflicts in Heschel's life was he was looked upon as either a poet or a theologian, or people said you're not a theologian, you're a poet. I think they were actually saying more, you're not a scholar, you're a poet.
Okay. Okay.
They didn't know what theology. They didn't have any use for theology.
Yeah.
Back then.
You and I are talking about different people. The people who said you are a poet, not a scholar, are basically Talmud faculty at JTS. Right. I'm not talking about that. Meaning, I'm talking about how philosophers receive Heschel, of which there were none at JTS, more or less. Right. I always like to say the Jewish Theological Seminary is one of the most ironically named institutions in Jewish history. Right. No, right. Because this is not. It's because it's not a particular theological place. By the way, it's true about the Jewish community as a whole. Right. Modern Orthodoxy doesn't have a theological bone in its cultural body. Right. It was actually thinking about theological questions. Right. The conservative movement never did that. Heschel was like some kind of lunatic, right? Who was often told, "Oh, theology is for Christians," right? Which is precisely what he found to be sort of repugnant and outrageous. But I'm talking about even people. I mean, not so long ago, someone wrote, a very dear friend of mine who's a very good scholar, wrote an article in the New Republic in which he said, when one reads Heschel, one has the feeling that one is reading poetry rather than theology. And that's the sentence that Heschel would have gone nuts, saying, what is the meaning of that rather than? Poetry is about finding language for that which simple prose cannot say. And I'm talking about something that can't be captured in language. What am I supposed to use to talk about God? Simple declarative sentences? What are you, an idiot? Right? That's his That's his crazy talk, right? Simple, what's called univocal language in philosophy. You can't use that to talk about God, right? By definition, your language is indicative, as he likes to put it, not descriptive. That's poetry. There's much more to say about that. But so yes, I agree with what you say, but I think there's only two different conversations. Now, why isn't the worship of nature enough? So this is a really huge, huge question, which I will happily talk about more another time. I think here's, I don't know in this sentence. Okay, Heschel would say first of all this. Okay, the Torah, if I take it seriously, one of the main claims it makes is that nature and God are not the same thing. That's a theological claim. It's not an answer to your question. It's a theological claim, right? In other words, if I'm going to claim to be a Jewish theologian and, let's say, a pantheist, or, say in Yiddish, noch besser, a nature worshiper, right? A worshiper of nature, right? I'm going to have to deal with the fact that I'm going to have to do some wild exegetical pyrotechnics in order to make the claim that I am a continuous reader of the Bible. As, by the way, many people in Kabbalah did just that. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying you have to do that. The argument is, I think, also that God, this is not something that Heschel explicitly says, but I think this is implicit there. A contemporary person who actually says this quite nicely, Kedar Cohen, he said a very simple, clear way, is Jonathan Sachs. Simple was not an insult, I'm talking about this sort of very clear, right? That the claim of Jewish theology is that what it means to worship a transcendent God is that every status quo and every reality in the world is relativized. Nothing about the world is ultimate. That means, now I'm not sure if this is Sachs or me talking, but that means that every political arrangement that exists is not ultimate. That's, by the way, why Genesis 1 refuses to describe any political arrangements, unlike almost every creation text in the ancient Near East. That's why the monarchy is not primordial. Because there is no sanctification by saying, oh, this political arrangement is God's political arrangement. And the danger of pantheism, or nature worship, I'm not sure those are exactly synonyms, but they often go together. The danger of pantheism is it basically says, what is God. Heschel says, what is a nightmare. God is the one who ensures that we can actually say that and be right. God is the one who says, oh, you think the status quo is ultimate? I believe in a God who shatters the status quo. You think slavery of the Israelites for hundreds of years is just the way the world is? Watch this. You think you can do whatever you want to the widows and the orphans? Have you met Amos? I just sent him to tell you where you're headed. In other words, the meaning of transcendence is, one of the radical meanings of transcendence is nothing in this world is ultimate. And that's what it means to believe in the possibility of transformation. So, see, I think that the challenge is that very often in modern discourse, by modern here I mean contemporary, the way a lot of contemporary people talk, it's like I can have a choice. Either, like, the world is God and God is everything, or nature is totally unsacred, desanctified, and to be exploited in whatever ways I want, right? I think Heschel thinks that dichotomy is sort of like absurd, because nature is totally holy because it was created by God. I and nature come from the same place. But it's not God any more than I am God. Tzelem Elohim is not Elohim. Right? And similarly, the world, which is replete with indicativeness, I love that phrase, the world which points to God is not God. I mean, there's much, much more to say about that, but I think that's the core claim. I mean, the ethical meaning of divine transcendence is nothing in the world is, for all eternity, set as the way the world has to be. It isn't God. None of it is God. And that's what the sort of thunderous presence of God in the Bible ideally is supposed to mean, right? that it's forbidden to say that's just the way the world is. What do you mean? It's the way the world is. What are you talking about? What do you think, the world is God? Come along a bunch of pantheists who say, yeah. Heschel says, that's kfira, right? That's, like, I'm willing to look at them, that's heretical. Or, to use good Jewish polemical language, that's pagan. Now, no Jewish theologian is a good historian of paganism, right? Paganism becomes a kind of cultural polemical category, but there's a philosophical claim under the use there. Whether it's an accurate description of everyone who calls himself a pagan in human history is a totally different discussion, but I think it's clear what I'm trying to gesture. Okay, I know there are probably more questions and things to say, but I also know there are many people in this room who told me they're like dying to get out the door and watch the debate. So I thank you very much. I hope to see you next week, and have a good weekend.